Good morning. I'm Melanie Risden with the Western Standard, and we're going to be checking in with a Calgary lawyer, Leighton Grey with Grey Wowk Spencer LLP, and we're going to be discussing a bit about employment law and human rights law, and just getting into some of the issues that we're seeing. A lot of people have a lot of questions right now around employment law, especially with regard to the vaccine mandates. So we're going to touch base with Leighton here very quickly. But first, we're going to head to our newsroom. We're going to talk to Dave, our news editor, and we're going to get a little bit of an update on some of the stories we have been working on this morning and perhaps some that are coming this afternoon. Hey, Dave.
How's it going, Mel? I'm missing you already in the newsroom.
Oh, I know. So we've got some good stories.
You enjoy your time in TV land, though. I know you'll be coming back to me soon.
I will be. So what do we have for some news stories today?
Well, it's been another busy morning, as usual. Linda Slobodian, our Manitoba reporter / columnist, has just filed a good story on the Manitoba government is going to be sending 300 patients south of the border into Fargo for serious spinal surgeries. 300. I'm not sure if they're moving them all in Greyhound buses or what, but more details are coming on that later on this afternoon. But Linda's got the story up there now. You've actually done a story, Mel, on some good news out of the UK today. Prime Minister Boris Johnson basically has announced an end to all of the COVID restrictions. They were hammered for a couple of weeks by Omicron. But now the infection rates seem to have stabilized and are now dropping. So the UK government is withdrawing things like face mask mandates and vaccine passports. So that's a bit of good news on that side of the pond. New inflation figures today, again, telling us what Canadians already know. It's getting more and more expensive out there, whether to fill your gas tank or buy groceries. 4.8% was the official rate for last month. Quickly, Canadian Taxpayers Federation jumped in and called for an immediate reduction in taxes from the Trudeau government. Aaron O'Toole, the opposition leader, also chimed in with his thoughts on it. So that's a story up there. And an interesting story we've got on illegal immigration, up 40-fold since the pandemic started. It's so bad that the federal government has had to book 11 separate hotels down in Quebec just to house these illegal immigrants. The Quebec border crossing area is the worst, and I guess British Columbia is second. Mike Thomas, a new addition to the Western Standard. He's got decades of experience covering the real estate market in Calgary and elsewhere. He's got an interesting piece looking across Western Canada, the various big cities, on just what your local real estate price has done for last year and how much money you've made in home equity. But make sure you hide it, because I'm sure the Liberals are going to tax it anyways. So that's what's on the site for right now, Mel.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'm sure more to come as the afternoon unfolds. So thanks, Dave. Thanks for the update.
You're welcome.
All right. So we are going to check in now with a Calgary lawyer, Leighton Grey. Actually, the Grey Wowk Spencer LLP sort of works between Calgary and Cold Lake. And so we're going to talk a bit about employment law. Now, I know that the law firm and Leighton also represent quite a few different sectors when it comes to employment law. So we'll introduce you to Leighton. First of all, thanks for joining us today, Leighton, and giving us a bit of an update. So give me a little bit of background on who you're supporting right now, what kind of cases you're working on, what kind of clients you're working with regard to the employment and human rights issues.
All right. First of all, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time speaking to the Western Standard. I've followed you very regularly, and I see that you've had my good friend and colleague James Kitchen on before.
Yes.
We've been working very, very intensely over the past several months, specifically in relation to vaccine mandate cases, as these cases really came to the fore in really October and November of last year, not coincidentally after the last federal election. Our work is not on behalf of employers. It's not on behalf of unions. We act for workers. And the reason what we've seen in acting on behalf of workers, both unionized and non-unionized, is I've come to the informed opinion that the vaccine mandates really have nothing to do with health and safety. I think that recent data, real world data about the ineffectiveness of the vaccines, both in terms of preventing infection and preventing transmission of the virus, have informed this opinion, and also the fact that the virus itself is not cooperating, because let's face it, everybody is getting Omicron because it's 140,000 times more transmissible, I understand, than the original virus. Mm-hmm. But what's really going on, in my respectful view, with vaccine mandates is it's really a surreptitious attack on the Canadian working class. It's designed to hit the Canadian workers, people I call the best Canadians, the glue Canadians, the ones who are really supporting their communities and paying all the taxes and serving on school boards and doing all the things that really support our country. It's an attack on them so that they lose the ability, the freedom that comes from having an income to support their families, to acquire and maintain personal property. The vaccine mandates do not hit destitute people. They do not hit street people. They do not hit really people in prisons. They do not hit the political class or the uber rich. They hit the Canadian working class. And it's my view that this is a weaponization of COVID-19 as a means to achieve a political agenda that's been very clearly and publicly mapped out by the Liberal government in Ottawa.
Now, a lot of things are starting to change, especially as you mentioned with the Omicron variant and how it is highly infectious, but really much less severe in symptoms and illness. So a lot of things are starting to change. I mean, even this morning, as we mentioned, we just did a story covering how UK is moving completely away from mandates. They're moving away from mask mandates. They're moving away from the vaccine mandates. And so we're seeing this sort of unravel in other countries as well. And I know in Canada, you were just mentioning that the Treasury Board has sort of updated the work from home guidelines and have now said that instead of the mandate being federally imposed, it's going to be sort of left to the different departments to be decided on whether federal employees will be mandated. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I can. More broadly speaking, I think you make a great point about what's going on in Britain. I think that if you look back over the past 18 months or 2 years, I think it's fair to say that Britain has been a little bit ahead of North America, maybe 3 to 6 months ahead of us in terms of signaling to us what's coming from COVID. And it is encouraging to see that in Britain, really, they're starting to wake up to what the people on our side of the case have been saying for about 2 years. There's a really, really excellent source of information that's been largely banned on social media and the internet, and which Dr. Fauci has publicly criticized, called the Great Barrington Declaration, which was formulated by a group of world-renowned scientists. And if you go back and look at that document now, about 2 years on, virtually everything that they were saying 2 years ago has come true. The only jurisdictions that really paid close attention to the Great Barrington Declaration and instituted it were places like Texas and Florida and Tennessee. And you can go and you can look at how they have fared in terms of COVID-19 versus what the lockdown restrictions have done. And I think anyone can see that the lockdown restrictions have been a huge mistake. So it's very encouraging to see that some of these governments, the British government, are starting to see the need for a new policy in terms of COVID. I also noticed in the news very recently, Bill Gates, who of course has been a proponent of vaccines, in fact, a purveyor of vaccines, is saying that Omicron is essentially the common cold and that we have to start dealing with Omicron and COVID as though it is an endemic situation. There's also been signals in Canada that this is coming. I saw a recent interview that Dr. Bonnie Henry, who's the Chief Medical Officer for British Columbia, gave, where she said things along the same lines. In other words, she basically said that she sees Omicron as an encouraging sign that COVID-19 has essentially run its course and that we can see the end of COVID. What's interesting about that, and again, this is my opinion as somebody who's been following this story, this narrative for about 2 years and following it very closely as someone who's immersed in it. I think what we're seeing is governments especially trying to find an exit strategy, an end to COVID, let's say an elegant exit to it. And I think we're starting to see preparation for that. At the same time, what's interesting is we're seeing this competing force, this tension, where some people, in particular our Prime Minister in the province of Quebec, or at least the Quebec government, are really trying to race against the sunset to push these vaccine mandates through as far as possible, really against, in defiance of all sense and everything that we're learning daily about COVID-19 and the effectiveness of vaccines. So to sum it all up, I think that if I'm being optimistic here, we are coming to the end of COVID, and that's a good sign. I think that what Canadians need to be concerned about, and vaccine mandates are, I think, an indicator of this. I think we still need to be watchful of government overreach, because to me, apart from the impacts of the lockdowns and what we've done to children, and what we've done to our communities and families, and what we've done to the economy, the impacts of which will be generational. The greatest long-lasting concern that I have as a human rights lawyer and as somebody who has a conservative/libertarian bent is the extent to which COVID-19 has allowed government to enter every single aspect of human affairs in the name of safety, security, and public health. So I think as Canadians, we're going to need to be much more watchful about government overreach, and people like me will be advocating in the aftermath of COVID for serious legislative change, which will restrict, for example, the accessibility, the easy accessibility of governments to declare states of emergency and to assume really undemocratic, unconstitutional executive powers. And I think also to set limits upon government spending, because I think if we had limits on the ability of the federal government to spend money, let's say back in March of 2020, I think that that would have been beneficial to Canadians in two respects. Firstly, it would have prevented the ungodly, unconscionable spending that has driven our country into hopeless debt. And we're dealing with, endemic, really frightening inflation and tax increases like Mr. Naylor was just talking about as a result of that. But it also would have forced our government to be much more resourceful and creative and wise about the decisions that they were going to make in order to deal with the pandemic, as opposed to simply, adopting the philosophy that no problem can be defeated if we throw enough money at it.
So my question to you is this then. So, there's been sort of a shift in some of the narrative that's been going on. And I know, again, with this decision that's come down that was announced just 2 days ago from the feds, basically that the federal public service is going, so The feds are going to leave it to the different departments to determine whether they're going to mandate vaccination, whether they're going to allow workers to come back to work who work from home. I mean, that to me, when we're talking about even the logic behind the law and talking about real public safety, I happen to have a friend who worked for an airline as a call center employee, and she was put on leave without pay for, she worked from home and was not able to do her job working from home. I mean, what, like legally, that I just can't understand the leg that they would have to stand on to say that that is a public safety issue for somebody working from home being required to be vaccinated. I'm sure you're dealing with that for other clients as well, but what's your thoughts on that?
No, it's a great point, and actually it supports, it really informs the opinion that I expressed a moment ago about the fact that the vaccine mandates really have little or nothing to do with occupational health and safety, because the vaccines really are not protecting workers. The people who have taken the vaccine have not been protected, for example, from Omicron. Coming back to the question about the Treasury Board, I think that's an example of what I was saying earlier, where I think governments are turning away from, or trying to turn away from, the expansion of, or the extension of the COVID narrative. The Treasury Board decision, I think, is very important in and of itself, because apart from CRA, the revenue agent, Canada Revenue Agency, every other government agency and department relies upon funding that comes through the Treasury Board. The Treasury Board is sort of the circulatory system for the federal government. And the delegation, or let's say the walking back of the blanket vaccine mandate that you talked about is significant, because it didn't really exist before. In fact, if you trace it back a couple of steps, you'll see that the letters of appointment that Prime Minister Trudeau sent to people like Minister Fortier, who's the president of the Treasury Board, in those letters appointing these new ministers when he had his last cabinet shuffle, he specifically charged them with the duty to ensure that everyone in their department is vaccinated. So I think on one view of the matter, we can look at this Treasury Board announcement as a promising sign that perhaps the winter is starting to thaw. However, I would say that we still need to be, as Canadians, we still need to be vigilant and watchful, much more vigilant and watchful of the actions of our governments than we ever have been before. I think I read a book recently that I'd recommend to your viewers that was written by Conrad Black, his most recent book, and in it he talks about how well Canada historically has been governed, and as a result, Canadians are very, very trustful of government. And but I think we've entered a new era. I think that going forward, we're all going to have to be much more watchful, much more questioning of what the government has been telling us. Not the least of which, and this might be the most concerning thing about the public health system, if we can call it that, in Canada. Perhaps the most concerning thing to me is the high level of censorship and the use of things like words like misinformation, where we've essentially been told from the very beginning that we shouldn't look at other sources of information. We shouldn't look at things like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or other therapeuticals, even though Pfizer is developing one of their own right now, because that information is not coming from government. In other words, the only reliable source of information about public health comes from government. When you track through, for example, what the Alberta government has been telling us about public health information, it's basically been an avalanche of inconsistency. In fact, I don't think any party has put out more misinformation about COVID-19 than our governments.
It's interesting you bring that up because we actually just aired a video from MLA Peter Guthrie from the Airdrie Cochrane area. And he said the exact same thing, taking into question AHS, the fact that it seems as though things have obviously changed from the beginning of the pandemic to the end. I mean, in the beginning, we didn't have much information, we didn't have much data, and we also didn't have vaccines. And Peter Guthrie kind of brings it to the forefront that now we have these things, we have these tools we're looking at, but the narrative and the response has not changed. So he's talking about how, even in our province, AHS is kind of working in this circular motion where they're just not adapting to the data that we have and the information that we have and changing course. And he talked about the billions that have even been spent in our province alone, yet we don't have an increase in hospital beds. We don't have an increase in ICU capacity. Our hospitals, we're still struggling at times for capacity. So, the question too is, where's the money been spent, right? I mean, there seems to be, a lot of talk of this being a real tax on our healthcare system, but yet, where was the money spent as far as expanding that capacity level in our province? So
Sorry, that's an excellent point. In fact, I agree with Mr. Guthrie. I would go a bit further though, and in that I'm actually counsel on a case that is being brought by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms against the Alberta government over charter violations stemming from the lockdown restrictions. And as part of that case, which is going to be heard in Calgary next month, we're going to be cross-examining Dr. Hinshaw and some of the other experts that the Alberta government is producing or has produced in support of lockdown measures. And as part of my preparations for that hearing, I've been going through a binder of every single press release that Dr. Hinshaw has made. And I can tell you, going back to even February and March of 2020, Dr. Hinshaw was telling us that children were at very low risk. We knew that already, even before the virus hit Alberta in earnest. The Alberta government was already aware of that, and they also knew very, very early, even before the World Health Organization declared a worldwide pandemic, that the most at-risk group were the elderly. And yet that has not really informed any of the policies that you talk about that were wasteful and damaging. There is no evidence that I'm aware of to support the fallacy that there is a pandemic among children. And yet one could frame a very persuasive argument that the most seriously adversely affected group by COVID, not because of the virus, but because of the way that our governments have chosen to deal with the virus through lockdown restrictions, that children are the most affected group. Even today, children in Alberta, the ones who are able to go to school, have to wear masks. They have to social distance. In most schools, they cannot even remove masks to drink water. And there is a plethora of evidence to show that these masks restrict breathing, that impact their learning. I even saw a recent study that said that long-term carbon dioxide exposure due to the mask and the toxicity from it has long-term impacts on kidney function. So I think there is a mountain of evidence, intellectually the size of the Canadian Rockies, that these lockdown measures are just a terrible, terrible error of history. And the sooner that we stop this madness and we get out of it and we find better ways to manage the risk of COVID-19, whatever that is, the better. But to continue and to impose these indefinite lockdowns, and it's important to know here that because of changes made to public health legislation in provinces like Alberta and BC, even though the legislation sets time limitations for the expiry of these emergency measures, the provinces of BC and Alberta have actually put in special provisions to extend these measures indefinitely. So that in Alberta, we're not going to be out of these lockdown measures, and we're not going to be out of a health emergency until Dina Hinshaw declares that we are.
Now, the case you were referencing, this one that you're working on right now with the JCCF, that one's the case against suing the provincial government. I understand that we reported on this a couple of months ago. Actually, I understand this has been sort of, the can has been kicked quite a few times down the road.
Protracted, yes.
Yeah. What's happened there? I know Hinshaw was supposed to be in court in September, but didn't choose, but said that she wasn't available because she was dealing with the pandemic. This has been so stretched out. What's happening?
Well, what happened in September was that we were supposed to go to hearing in the third week of September. And a few days before that hearing was to start, it was to be an in-person hearing. The province, Dr. Hinshaw, declared a further public health emergency. And we were essentially told that she would be indefinitely unavailable because of dealing with the pandemic. And myself and the other lawyer involved, Jeffrey Rath, we're told that we could proceed with the hearing, but without Dr. Hinshaw's involvement. That seemed to us rather like having a birthday party without a cake, and she's the key witness in the case.
Right. Yeah.
And so we were placed in a situation where we really could not proceed with the hearing, and we were faced with a necessary adjournment. We then learned shortly afterward that she took the 2 or 3 days when she was supposed to be testifying, she took them off anyway. What happened then is in the early part of this year, right before Christmas, in the early part of this year, we secured new hearing dates, which will begin in the middle part of February. The most recent development, to answer your question, is that we've been approached by lawyers for the Alberta government where they want to have the entire hearing done in a virtual setting, so that under a platform called WebEx, we would conduct the whole trial, which amounts to cross-examination of Dr. Hinshaw and other experts into a WebEx format. Both myself and Mr. Rath feel quite strongly that would seriously impair our ability to conduct a proper cross-examination of Dr. Hinshaw. So we've taken the position that we would agree to the WebEx hearing, with the exception of Dr. Hinshaw, whom we would want to have testify in hearing. The main reason for that is because it's our intention to confront her with literally hundreds of documents for the purposes of impeachment, to attack her reliability and credibility in terms of the statements that she's made to the public about COVID-19 and lockdown measures. Most recently, your listeners are probably aware of a recent press release that was made by Dr. Hinshaw, and really a public admission by both she and Alberta Health Services, that the numbers of people during the heart of the pandemic, which were used as really the impetus for lockdown measures, were misrepresented to the public, in that the number of people who are actually in ICU with COVID versus people who tested positively for COVID but were not there really suffering from COVID symptoms were misrepresented to the public. So that's one example of the type of contradiction that we would want to put to Dr. Hinshaw under oath, and we want to do it with her in person as opposed to WebEx. The Justice, Court of Queen's Bench Justice Romain, is going to rule on that application, and we'll be very interested to see over the next few days what she decides. I know, for example, another case, a similar case in Manitoba, was done entirely with virtual testimony under a virtual platform, and so it's conceivable that Justice Romain will agree to the government's request, but for what it's worth, we've done our best to oppose that application.
Now, I'm curious, Leighton, can the average person watch in if this is a WebEx hearing? Can the average person watch in? Because I'm seeing a lot of comments from our viewers that are saying they would like to be able to, and they think it should be made public, that the public can watch this hearing.
Well, that's part of the reason why we wanted to have an in-person hearing, because our courts are still open to the public, and to my knowledge, there was no restriction placed upon the number of people who are going to be in the courtroom at any given time. However, under the virtual platform, I don't know the precise answer to the question. I expect that it will be possible for a certain number of people to be on a platform to view the trial. I don't know the precise circumstances under which that type of access is going to be granted. I would expect that members of the media, accredited media, would probably be given preference. But it's important to note, and it's disappointing actually, that this is a very important case. It might be the most important civil case that's ongoing in the entire province, and yet most people don't know anything about it because it hasn't been really publicized at all in the legacy media. So we're grateful for people like the Western Standard to get this word out to the people. But the hearing is going to take place during the last 2.5 weeks of February. It'll be decided in Calgary, but it's likely that most of the participants will not be in the same courtroom. Again, this is due to the ongoing health emergency that the province of Alberta has declared, and it really has been in place since the middle part of September.
Right. So I will do my best to look into that to see if there's an option to potentially watch this in some way. Is there any way that you know of to petition that the court make this viewable from any? I'm just responding to an overwhelming response here from a lot of viewers who think this should definitely be something the public is allowed to watch.
Well, obviously there is the option of contacting your MLA,
okay,
and sending emails or calls. Of course, they are the people who are charged with the responsibility of representing them locally. There may be information available on the Alberta Courts website. I would caution people against inundating the courthouse with calls, because the clerks there are very, very busy, and of course they're dealing with a lot of COVID restrictions themselves and really coping well with that. So I would caution people about inundating them with inquiries about this. But that's what I would suggest. Probably the best avenue would be to contact your local MLA, because they would have some influence over talking to the Alberta government about perhaps increasing the level of visibility of this hearing. Of course, it's entirely conceivable, and I don't know this to be true, that the Alberta government would not want the public to be able to widely view what's going on in the hearing. I hope that that's not true, because the issues that are being dealt with in that hearing really concern whether lockdown restrictions violate essential freedoms, fundamental freedoms that Canadians have under the Charter, under Section 2 of the Charter in particular. Freedom of religion is a huge one. But the real question is whether what the lockdown restrictions have done in terms of impacting Albertans is whether that outweighs any good that was done in terms of preventing the infection and transmission of COVID-19. If there's a strong case to be made for saying that anything that the Alberta government has done has reduced the infection rates and transmissibility of COVID-19, I can't see it. In fact, we have a very close comparable. If we look at the state of Florida, which has been open really since last spring, with no COVID restrictions, but for the concentration of their public health resources on the most vulnerable population, which is obviously the elderly. We can see that Florida actually has one of the lowest infection, I believe the lowest infection rate in all of North America, without masking, without social distancing, without closing down businesses, without vaccine mandates and things of that nature. But the case is really about what are the impacts of these lockdown restrictions, and are they a reasonable limit on the constitutionally protected freedoms that are enshrined in our charter. One of the witnesses in our case is a man named Brian Peckford, who is the last surviving premier who was at the table when the charter was conceived and signed into law. And he's been a very outspoken critic of the way that governments and our courts have dealt with this. And we hope to have him testify at the hearing to talk about this, to say that really the approach that's being taken to assessment of this charter question, and particularly to the saving provision under Section 1 of the charter, saying that this is wrong-headed. We know what he's going to say. It's a question of whether the court is going to give it any credence or any weight. We hope that the court does, because our charter is going to turn 40 in April. It's very important. It's a cherished part of our nation, and it's an expression of our collective culture and our history and our values. And it's not being respected right now in this country, and it must be, because without it, as we've discovered over the last couple of years, we're not very free.
What's always seemed so surprising to me in these last 2 years is that there hasn't been any public forums. And, I think that's what has led to people feeling so much mistrust and feeling so misled and lied to, flat out lied to. I mean, you alluded to the conversation or the announcement Dr. Hinshaw had. I know yesterday they also started to report on the percentages of hospitalizations that are because of COVID, not just with COVID. I mean, that's a big difference. I know, if somebody's in there with a broken arm or a hip surgery, and that's the reason they're in the hospital, but they're counted as a COVID case and reported on as a COVID case just because they tested positive in hospital. I mean, it's created such a fear narrative, to just be reporting on all of these cases. So yesterday was the first time that I actually saw Hinshaw report on the percentage, and it was kind of 50-50, really. 50% of the people were in there because of COVID, and 50% were in there. This is just regular hospitalizations. I know it was higher. It was in the 70% range for people in ICU, but that, I think that makes a difference. And I think, I think there have been a lot of calls from the public and others that AHS be more transparent, and the ministry be more transparent with these numbers and the reporting.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I must say, I feel very badly for people who I see walking around outside with masks on. They're, in fact, the government's expert in the Manitoba case was asked under oath whether there was any study showing that there was a risk of contracting COVID outside. And they said, quite frankly, that there is not. There's virtually no risk of getting COVID outside, and yet you see people walking around with masks on. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who is the chief expert on our side in the Ingram case that we were just talking about, and also one of the 3 authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, he is a professor of medicine and an expert in virology and epidemiology at Stanford University in California. He, in discussing this with him, it's his opinion that the real pandemic is, as you quite rightly state, is fear. And what Dr. Bhattacharya said to me his greatest concern, because of course, just like Dr. Hinshaw, he's a professional in public health. But Dr. Bhattacharya's opinion, and this is a man with 35-page resume, 1,400 peer-reviewed scientific articles. He said the greatest legacy of public health out of COVID is going to be a legacy of distrust of public health, just as you say. And so the net effect of that, unfortunately, is that although it's good, and we're fortunate that COVID-19 did not turn out to be the worldwide super killer that we thought it was going to be, perhaps in February, March, 2 years ago. When we do get a very, very dangerous virus, like, for example, an Ebola, where things like contact tracing and social distancing and quarantining will be necessary in order to protect the public, because Ebola is a virus that actually kills humans, as opposed to being as opposed to a coronavirus, which is really evolutionarily adapted to focusing on transmission as its success story. When we have a real killer virus, probably more than half the population, based upon recent polls, is not going to take that seriously, because they will have learned from COVID-19 to distrust what public health officials tell us. And
That's a very good point.
What Dr.
Yeah.
Bhattacharya says basically is that what we have through COVID-19 is a distortion of the role of public health. The role of public health historically has been to provide the public with reliable information about the risk, the prevalent health risk, that they can use in order to make informed, responsible decisions to reduce their own risk and, by extension, the risk to the public. What public health has become under COVID-19 is an excuse to create a medical dictatorship, where people are infantilized and they're treated like children and told precisely what to do, and if they don't, that they'll get seriously sick and die and overwhelm the healthcare system. And in fact, what we found, and Mr. Naylor was just talking about what's happening in Manitoba, it's not COVID-19 that's overwhelmed the health system, but it's lockdowns and the restrictions and the way that our healthcare systems are managed and rationalized and mismanaged and bureaucratized that is the greatest threat to our health, not COVID-19, but in my view, the irresponsible way in which public resources are being used and applied as regards public health care.
And I think for me, the sort of, pink elephant in the room is the hundreds of billions of dollars federally that's been spent over these last 2 years. And we're still in no better position. We're still seeing hospital. I mean, that money, I'm certain, could have opened thousands upon thousands of hospital beds if truly the issue in our country is a shortage of beds and shortage of care workers. You would think that the hundreds of billions that we've spent would have gone a long way to fix that. So yeah, there's I think a real realization now that there's been some huge mismanagement financially as well through this pandemic that is leading to mistrust, which, I think is in a way a good thing, because as you're calling on people that we need to be, really wary moving forward and really keeping a good eye on things. I think this will help, people focus on that a little bit more.
I agree, and this gets back to my other point about in the aftermath of COVID. I think that as Canadians, we need to demand some legislative changes that are going to place some restrictions on the ability of governments to do things like spend money and to drive the country into debt. If you look at right now, we have a record debt in this country, and really, if we had, as you quite rightly pointed out, if we had rationalized our resources and been more intelligent, more wise in the way that we use them, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in as a country right now, with expanding debt, inflation, and a legacy that we're passing on to our grandchildren's children of having to pay back the money that was literally doled out under COVID. That was a disastrous policy, which created a problem that I think is going to be much more serious and long-lasting and punitive to not only this generation, but future generations of Canadians than COVID-19 would ever be, because it looks as though we're coming to the end of COVID-19, thankfully, knock wood. But we're going to have this legacy of debt and inflation for a long, long time to come. Yeah,
very long time. Now, Leighton, we are still in the midst of it here in this province and in this country specifically too. A lot of people still facing being put on leave without pay. As we speak, I'm hearing from people every day who are facing this. And I mean, we're talking, when we get into the employment laws and human rights laws, I mean, some of even the idea of the exemption, a religious exemption, for instance, I have somebody who's dealing with looking at trying to get a religious exemption as we speak, to continue working. What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of religious exemptions and the fact that they are being sort of blatantly ignored or rejected?
Well, I can tell you that with a couple of notable exceptions, every single religious exemption that has been applied for by our clients, and that's numbering several hundred people, no religious exemption has been granted. The most extreme case is a lady who worked for many years for the Salvation Army. That's the Salvation Army. Mm-hmm. And her religious exemption was denied because they had no regard for her Christian faith.
And
so
they're
the Salvation Army
faith-based organization, right?
Regard for someone's Christian religious beliefs. Where do you go? Mm-hmm. So I have a suspicion that these exemption claims, whether they're medical or they're religious, in virtually every case that I've seen, whenever a worker applies for these exemptions, they have to provide very detailed personal information about themselves, their religious beliefs, their medical background, that would normally be protected by privacy legislation.
Right. And
I've been advising our clients that I'm very concerned about the disclosure of this information, because I'm not. If these exemptions are just being uniformly denied, and they are, like we're talking about form letters in response, where it's clear that these applications have been dismissed out of hand, that there may be a much more surreptitious purpose behind the collection of this data. We know how important and valuable people's data is nowadays. In fact, this is the main asset that companies like Meta, formerly Facebook, Google, Twitter, they sell this data. It's very, very valuable. And I'm concerned about employers and public and private employers having this information and the use that they're making of it, particularly in a situation where it seems clear that the goal of mandatory vaccination in Canada is to have everyone carry around vaccine passports with QR codes, where we can be tracked everywhere we go and whatever we do. So the exemptions themselves have been, as I said, not a very useful exercise for most workers. And I would caution people who are thinking about applying for exemptions to be very mindful of the risk of providing this personal information to an employer who is in the act of violating your human rights.
So, but all of these people that are reaching out with questions, they're just hoping somebody can give them some guidance. What should I do? My employer's, kind of my back's against the wall with my employer. I need to stay employed. I need to be making money. I don't want to get vaccinated. But you're also saying, I would hazard that you produce all of that information to your employer. What do you recommend? What is the best course that these people can take?
Well, I still think people should claim their exemptions. The best exemption, in my opinion, is to claim the doctrine of informed consent. There's an eminent doctor named Dr. Payne, P-A-Y-N-E, who wrote a brilliant letter last September, 20-page letter to Dr. Hinshaw. The last 3 or 4 pages of that are just references, because the letter is so well done and so brilliantly noted up and cited, both medically and legally, that it really presents a complete argument in favor of the doctrine of informed consent. And the essence of that letter, just to boil it down, is that no one can provide informed consent to the taking of the COVID-19 vaccine. It traces back this all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Hippocrates, who is sort of the granddaddy of all doctors, famously said, do no harm, the Hippocratic Oath. But also in 1947, there was an international charter called the Nuremberg Code, which recognized that certain medical atrocities happened in the death camps in Europe during World War II. Medical experiments where people were injected with things, and heinous medical experiments were conducted on people against their will. The Nuremberg Code, people can Google that, and it sets out the whole doctrine of informed consent and states clearly that no person can be forced to put anything into their bodies against their consent. Dr. Payne's point, which is made out, as I said, very well in his letter, is that there's no person who can provide informed consent to the taking of the COVID-19 vaccines, because firstly, we can't be informed. We don't know the short-term impacts of the taking of these vaccines, which are still experimental until 2023. And by the way, Pfizer is about to release in March their next version of the vaccine, so that this is going to go on interminably. But also, apart from the short-term impacts of these vaccines, some of which are being reported and are horrifying, no one knows the long-term impacts of these vaccines.
That's right.
Both the medical and the long-term social impacts of both the vaccines and the vaccine mandates, which have been so divisive that our Prime Minister recently made a statement publicly that equated the unvaccinated with essentially political dissidents who are racist and misogynist. And of course, you have the Quebec government that has now passed legislation aimed at taxing and penalizing people who simply do not want to have a vaccine, which really is not a vaccine at all, but more of a bioweapon, ingested into their or injected into their bodies. So really, what I suggest to people in terms of exemptions, that's the best exemption claim you can have, because in that situation, you don't need to provide a lot of personal information to your employer in support of an exemption. What you're claiming is you're relying upon a well-documented and world-renowned and recognized claim for exemption from the application of a medicine. We've never had a situation, certainly in the West, where we've been privately and publicly extorted into taking a substance into our bodies, and publicly vilified and penalized for not doing so. It's an unprecedented situation. In fact, the government of Canada's own lawyers in a 1996 report to government told them that they couldn't do it because it violated the Constitution. And this is precisely why, in my opinion, employers, public and private, are being used as a mechanism, as a conduit to impose a vaccine mandate that is fundamentally illegal. In other words, governments are doing indirectly what they cannot do directly. Having said that, I have to applaud premiers like Mr. Kenney and Mr. Moe, who, despite the pressure that's coming from the federal government to impose these vaccine mandates, are standing firm and saying, no, we took this out of our public health legislation. We think this is wrong, and we won't have it. Unfortunately, that hasn't led to the repeal of these programs that are in place in Alberta that are requiring businesses and most public places to require proof of vaccination or proof of a negative COVID test just to enter.
Now, I'm sure you heard of the story out of Shell, Scotford's location, where they have now sort of reversed their vaccine mandate. They are not requiring any workers or contractors to show proof of vaccination. They are doing on-site testing for people who are coming on site, but no longer mandating, at least for now. It says that they've temporarily stopped. Thoughts on that? I mean, that seems hopeful as well. It seems like they're recognizing that maybe these decisions have not been wise business sense.
I think that is hopeful. I think it's a move in the right direction. I do not like the requirement of testing. However, I consider that to be still a human rights violation. Because what it is requiring people to do is to provide a bodily sample for analysis. That the results of that analysis are then have to be disclosed to the employer, and then if those results turn out to be unfavorable to the employee in terms of a positive result, then there are prejudicial impacts for the employee. So I equate that testing to be something similar to unjustified testing of people. For example, if they're out driving, and if the police can haul somebody off on the side of the road and take them down to the police station and test them for the presence of alcohol and test their blood alcohol level, even though there are no reasonable probable grounds for the belief that person is impaired. In this situation, we're testing asymptomatic people, and under circumstances where that really should stop. And Dr. Hinshaw recently stated in a press conference that she hinted strongly that perhaps this is something that we were going to stop doing. But then, of course, the federal government is telling us that I've ordered many millions of rapid tests that have been delivered to our schools. Another promising sign, apart from Shell, is I believe this was just announced. The National Hockey League has announced that after the All-Star break, which is upcoming, they will no longer be testing players for COVID-19 who are asymptomatic. So I think what we're seeing, if we want to sort of look at the bright side of the moon, is that there is a progression, a movement away from what I say and what many experts say is the myth of asymptomatic spread. It never made sense to be testing people who had no symptoms. The risk of asymptomatic spread of COVID-19 is vanishingly low. It always has been. We've known it for a very long time. And to have people going around wearing masks and social distancing and all these sorts of things really does no good and does tremendous harm. And so it is. I do applaud Shell for taking a very bold step, and I certainly am hopeful that other large companies, large-scale employers, will follow suit. Unfortunately, it hasn't yet gathered enough momentum that we can call it a trend. It's a step in the right direction, and let's hope that other employers follow suit. I think the big one is going to be the federal government, because really they are the drivers of all this stuff. I suspect that there are several provinces and I think Alberta is among them, who would like to have COVID-19 in the rearview mirror. Premier Kenney has expressed this repeatedly in some of his public statements. But it's very difficult to do that when the entire country is under public pressure from the federal government, which is the largest employer in Canada, to keep the COVID narrative going, despite all of the evidence that really COVID-19 no longer poses a serious public health risk, either at work or anywhere else, and that the lockdown restrictions and the vaccine mandates are doing much more harm, both presently and long term, than the virus ever has or could.
Mm-hmm. Now, Leighton, I know I've had you for about an hour, and if you can give me a little bit more time, I have a few more things that I wouldn't mind touching on with you if you have the time.
Certainly.
One of the things that I've had a lot of people bring up to me when it comes to the exemptions is the notice of liability, which isn't necessarily an exemption, but people have been, wondering if these notices of liability that they're presenting to their employer, telling the employer that you are taking responsibility, for any outcomes or any issues that I may suffer from, like what are your thoughts on those notice of liabilities? Are they effective? Do you recommend them?
I do endorse them. I do encourage them. I think that it is important for workers to let the employer know that they're taking the position that their rights, their employment, and their human rights are being violated, and to put the employer on notice that if these violations continue, that there will be legal repercussions. I'm not convinced, I'm not as cynical as some, I'm not convinced that most employers who are subjected to these vaccine mandates actually support them. In fact, I'm privy to, when I saw a correspondence exchange between the current Minister of Transport and the CEO of Canadian Pacific, in which the CEO of Canadian Pacific was basically saying to the minister that if the vaccine mandate, the Minister of Transport's order, were applied strictly, it would essentially shut down Canadian Pacific. And the CEO was questioning how that would be good for the Canadian public to essentially shut down one of its essential railways, and especially in the context of where we're talking about constantly about supply chain problems. So I think that there's two purposes that are served by these liability letters, and my firm usually puts them into the form of something called the cease and desist letter. Firstly, it gives notice to the employer. It's information that they can use so that they are aware that certain numbers of their workers do not accept the vaccine mandate, are opposed to it. And I think that's important information for employers to have. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the employee has a duty to provide that information, but I think it certainly shows it's good conduct on the part of the employee to provide the employer with that information so that they can make proper decisions. And I think the second part of it is it does give notice to the employer that what they are doing exposes them to the risk of litigation. And I think that also informs the employer so that they can seek legal advice and make proper decisions. And it's just likely, and I believe this is happening, that as this situation develops, it's an organic situation that's in flux. I have no doubt that many of the employers, and Shell might be a great example, where some of their employers, I don't know this to be true, but it's entirely conceivable and even probable that some Shell employees complained about this and claimed exemptions and gave notice to the employer that they saw this as a human rights violation, and then a company like Shell went back and reassessed their original decision and then moved forward and made a better decision. I mean, companies are run by boards of directors, and they're beholden to shareholders. and they can only act on the best information that they have.
Mhm.
And I think this is an important purpose that these liability letters and cease and desist letters serve. And I think that, so I encourage workers to do it, not only for their own good, but for the good of the employer. And anything that's good for these employers, by extension, is good for Canadian workers and good for the Canadian economy.
Right. And it sounds like the more a company receives these notices of liability, it can sway their, like you're saying, it can sway their decisions, how they want to move forward with these mandates and whatnot. Because I think the louder their employees are, the more they're protesting this with these kinds of notices. I think you're right. It definitely can affect decisions down the road. Now, I know there are a few different sites that people can find these notice of liabilities, ones that you can sort of print off. Anything you can recommend where people can go to find a good notice of liability that's comprehensive?
Yeah, well, I mentioned my friend James Kitchen, who I said has been on, and he's a lawyer for an organization called the Liberty Coalition. They have a lot of documents like this on their website that are downloadable. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, which is based in Calgary, has information like that. Some of the cease and desist letters that we have produced are posted on the Rebel News site because many of our clients are engaged through an organization called the Democracy Fund, which is a third-party crowdfunding organization. And so when we do, for example, the University of Winnipeg lawsuit that has been publicized recently is an example of a case that we've undertaken on behalf of some teachers at the University of Winnipeg through the auspices and the support of the Democracy Fund. And so when there is actually a cease and desist letter, an example of that in relation to that case on the Rebel News website. So those are a few examples where people can access this information.
Great. Appreciate that. One of the other things I wanted to touch on with you, Leighton, is and you did mention it a little bit earlier, but this sort of overreach that's happened, especially when it comes to medical professionals, doctors who have been trying to, say, treat patients for COVID, or doing things against what strangely has been sort of deterred by the College of Physicians and Surgeons, or AHS, or the ministry. There seems to be this fear that's happening even for doctors. I know I've heard from a couple who've actually been rated by the College of Physicians and Surgeons. One of them was an interesting story that we covered on the lawyer, Jeffrey Rath. His doctor ended up getting rated, and they specifically went for Jeff Rath's file at his doctor's office while Mr. Rath was in active litigation against the College of Physicians and Surgeons, for clients. That seems like a massive overreach in my opinion. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the best expression of my thoughts about that are actually published in a paper that I've written, and if people are interested, it's on another website. There's a wonderful website called the Frontier Center for Public Policy. I've actually written a paper on this, but just to boil it down, what I say in that paper is that COVID-19, in my opinion, is an example of a trend, of a progression that's occurred in Canadian and in Western society and in Canada, whereby problems that we used to solve locally as individuals and as society, what we've done is we've delegated responsibility for that to the state. And what that has permitted the state to do is to translate that responsibility into power. And in my view, in terms of a successful functioning democracy, which Canada is set up to be and historically has been, right now we have an imbalance of power as between the individual and individual societies and the government. For example, historically, as communities in Canada, we've been able to do a very effective job to deal with things like, forest fires, flash floods, things of that nature, public emergencies and health emergencies. And the public, that is society versus the state versus government, has been able to do a much better job of managing resources and of providing real help to people and solving problems than governments have been able to do. But what we've had through COVID-19 is a situation whereby the power of government has been massively expanded. The best example of this, the best proof of this in Alberta is if you look at the Public Health Act. During COVID, the government of Alberta significantly amended the Public Health Act and bestowed upon Dr. Dina Hinshaw, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, dictatorial powers, executive powers, whereby she could declare laws. She could impose immediately prohibitions on activities, compel people to do things. And this made her, and she still is, the single most powerful person in the history of our province. And these, even after COVID is gone, those powers will remain. And that should be of concern to Albertans, because that's not a good thing. It's not a good way. It's not the way that our democracy is set up. The way that we all learned in social studies class about how laws are made in Canada, in terms of the proper functioning of a parliamentary democracy through debate and exchanging free ideas about the wisdom of laws, first reading, second reading, third reading, that's all been swept away. And for the past 2 years, Alberta and indeed all of Canada has been governed through executive dictatorial order. And it's in my respectful view, it's inverted the whole way that our democracy was intended to function. And although it's true that this executive form of government is more immediate and in some ways is more effective in terms of getting things done, I don't think that it serves the public good very well, because, and we can see the impacts of this, just if you sit down and you think about all the things that you can't do now that you could do a few years ago, before government was given all of this emergency dictatorial power. It's my view that these emergency powers should not exist at all. I think they're redundant. I don't think governments need to have these executive powers, these emergency powers, because our elected representatives could still get together and debate, for example, the wisdom of a lockdown or a vaccine mandate. And they could make those decisions in a much more democratic way. And that could have been done. And in my respectful view, should have been done. Just because the Alberta government, the existing Alberta government, happened to have been elected at the time democratically, that did not give them, in my view, the executive dictatorial power to ignore the constitutional process, to pass laws that clearly violate the Charter and violate the Constitution of Canada, and which severely restricted the civil liberties of all Albertans. So I think in the aftermath of COVID, one of the things we're going to need to do. And it's going to be difficult because people are not going to want to hear about COVID anymore. But I think we've got to get to a place in our society, in our government, in our law, where we sort of cut into and reduce. And I would like to see actually the abolition of these emergency powers, because they're quite unnecessary, and I don't think that they serve the public good.
Agreed. I noticed a comment here from Cheryl. She says she knows a lot of judges who were forced to be jabbed or lose their jobs. If our court system has broken our laws, how can we expect the judicial system to do the right thing?
Well, that's a great question. And actually, I gave a recent podcast interview. I was asked this question specifically about, some people say that, our judges are biased and just going along with the government. I don't happen to sign on to that. In fact, I know, because I've spent, a lifetime, the last 30 years appearing in the courts of our province, and I've never met a corrupt judge. All the judges I've known, and I do know, are very principled people. They care about Canada. They care about making good decisions. And they got into, or they went up to the bench because I think that by and large they felt that they had a duty and something to offer Canadians in terms of public service. The explanation, I would say, about why we haven't had decisions in Canada from the bench questioning the government's authority or setting aside these laws is for a couple of reasons. Number one, honestly, I think that people like me haven't done a good enough job of persuading courts to do it. We haven't presented. We need to present better evidence and better arguments to persuade a court to do it. I think then that's something that's on us that we're going to have to do. And I not only believe, I expect that as we go on and we develop better arguments and can produce better evidence, that the courts are going to be more questioning of these powers that our governments have been exercising. I think that's one part of it. Secondly, I think that courts have been historically reluctant to enter into the realm of being lawmakers. Our courts, the role of our courts is to interpret and apply the law in making rational decisions that are consistent with the Constitution. It's the role of government to create law. And so what we've been asking courts to do is very, very difficult. If you think about it, in the midst of a pandemic, we've been asking judges to come in and really second guess the laws that the governments have been making in order to deal with something called a pandemic. The only criticism that I would level at the courts, which I think is a fair one, is that courts have been very ready to presume the existence of something called a pandemic, as opposed to going deeper and really analyzing the evidence to determine the question of whether or not COVID-19 actually poses an existential crisis, a serious public health risk. But that gets back to the onus on lawyers. People like me, perhaps we haven't done a good enough job of persuading a court to enter into that inquiry. But I think there is a reluctance on the part of courts, and I think a healthy one, to not be quick to second guess and strike down. I mean, and let's take it to the nth degree. What if we had a court system that was constantly striking out the laws that government made? What kind of society would we have then? Then we'd be living under a judicial dictatorship, wouldn't we? So I think there's a balance there that needs to be struck. And I think that there are very good people in our courts, very intelligent people, highly principled people. And I think that ultimately they are going to strike that balance. We're going to see some decisions come about that are going to reveal very clearly that our judges are not biased. That in fact we still have a very well-functioning free court system. The other thing I would say in defense of the courts is that it has been very, very difficult to keep the courts open throughout the pandemic in the face of the information that the courts have been provided. And I can tell you from somebody who's working in the courts that the chief judges of our province have worked very hard and been very innovative in terms of continuing to provide access to justice for Albertans. So I think they deserve credit for doing that. I'm speaking, specifically the Chief Justice of the Court of Queen's Bench and also of the Court of Appeal. And also the pandemic, the one, I think, excellent development that will be a legacy that comes out of COVID-19 is that it has allowed the courts to really modernize some of its structures. For example, access to justice has been significantly improved in a lot of ways through the introduction and the advent of modern technology, like the one that you and I are accessing right now. So I don't buy into this idea that the courts are biased. I think that we still have a free and independent judicial system, and I think we're going to see better decisions or more favorable decisions to our side of the case as we go forward, if we're able to rise to the challenge of being more persuasive, providing the court with better evidence in these cases.
So Leighton, you're hopeful. You're optimistic.
I am.
Is that right?
I am. I believe in Canada. I believe in Canadians. I think we've got a great country. I think we have a great constitution. I don't think that we've been governed very well. I think that Canadians deserve better government, but we've got to demand it. We have to demand better government. If we demand better government, we're going to get better people going into government for the right reasons. I'm very concerned about what I see the grafting of power that these COVID-19 restrictions have made possible, and I think that we're going to be, if we do the right things and make the right decisions, we're going to be a much better country, more free country that is going to cherish freedom more, and I think that we'll be better equipped to deal with crises like a public health crisis going forward, if as a society we demand more of our government, and if we're willing to make the right decisions going forward. I'm optimistic that Canada still has a very bright future. We're going through a very difficult time, but as they say, strongest steel is forged in hottest fire, and this may be something that we had to go through in order to get to a better place in Canada. And I know many people in my profession believe that to be the case. And let's hope that we're all willing to do what it takes to get there. But it's going to take sacrifice. Liberty is not free. Benjamin Franklin famously wrote that one who would give up a little bit of liberty for some security will end up with neither and deserve neither. There's a price to be paid for freedom, and we all have to pay it, even if it means, for example, that we're not willing to trade our liberty and the integrity of our bodies for the security of a job.
Well, I'll tell you, we've got a lot of comments thanking you, and I get the impression that people are feeling a little bit more hopeful with what they've heard from you today. So I really appreciate that, Leighton. And I know you were mentioning that Frontier Center for Public Policy. You'd mentioned that was a fantastic resource with just loads of information that people can access. So what I'm going to do is make sure that that's on our website on the page for this story, for this interview. So I'll grab the URL from you and have that up on our page for people to access. And you know what, Leighton, it would be great to continue to check in with you. In fact, I would really like to talk with you again once that court case starts to move in February with the case against the provincial government. So hopefully I can check in with you again on that, and we can keep people updated on how that's going. And again, hopefully I can find out if there's any chance that can be a public option for people to watch.
Great. Thank you for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Leighton. And again, just really appreciate your optimism on how things are unfolding. And yeah, I appreciate your time today. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That was Leighton Grey with Grey Wowk Spencer LLP. I know all of the lawyers that we speak to on a regular basis are extremely busy with all sorts of cases representing everything from employment law to union law and whatnot. So again, if you're struggling with a situation with work, we'll have that website for Frontier Centre for Public Policy up for you to access. And again, it's Grey Wowk Spencer LLP. I will also have their the URL for their website for you to access coming up shortly. So thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and hopefully you're feeling a little bit more hopeful as well.